Robert Lawson wasn't a recluse, not in the way people often imagined. He didn't hate people, and he didn't retreat from society because of trauma or paranoia. He simply valued silence in a world that had become unbearably loud. After spending most of his adult life working as a state geological consultant, drafting complex terrain models and assessing seismic vulnerabilities, Robert had seen more conference rooms and artificial smiles than he cared to count. When he finally stepped away from the chaos of public contracts and environmental committees, he didn't celebrate with a trip abroad or a new car. Instead, he signed a deed. It wasn't a particularly glamorous purchase. Over 300 acres of underdeveloped, rugged valley land in a corner of the county most people had forgotten even existed. But to Robert, it was a return to something real. The land had once been part of a fragmented federal forestry grant, a patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions and misfiled ownerships until it was eventually made available through a quiet county auction. One of those legal oddities that slipped through with no press, no interest, and no competition. He submitted his sealed bid, won it outright, and spent the next 2 years restoring an old ranger outpost that had long since decayed into little more than a stone foundation and splintered beams. He built on the old bones, not for nostalgia but for continuity. The resulting cabin was something between rustic and quietly modern. Reclaimed wood, solar panels disguised under steep eaves, a buried water catchment system, and a reinforced cellar that served as both storm shelter and archive. No fences, no gates, just natural boundaries. Robert believed in boundaries that made sense. Geological formations, not arbitrary property lines. He registered the land under its historical designation, not just as a private property, but as a managed environmental tract with restricted access and minimal development obligations. It wasn't a political move, just a practical one. That designation allowed him to maintain a certain level of independence from zoning changes, tax reclassifications, and the creeping bureaucracy of newly forming communities. For 3 years, everything went smoothly. He maintained trails, submitted quarterly soil and water quality reports to the county, and remained largely unnoticed by the few residents scattered on the outskirts of the valley. People who, like him, had no interest in neighborhood councils or homeowners associations. The silence was not empty. It was rich, filled with the chirping of crickets, the hiss of wind through tall grass, and the occasional distant echo of a hawk's cry slicing through the morning. He had learned the language of the land again, and it welcomed him like an old friend. Then, as always, progress came creeping on the horizon, not with bulldozers or survey markers at first, but with SUVs and champagne ribbon-cutting ceremonies. On the eastern ridge of the valley about 2 miles uphill from Robert's cabin, a new development began to emerge. It was called Valley Crest Enclave, a high-end gated community with manicured lots, pressure-washed stone facades, and wide roads that looked wildly out of place amid the wild curvature of the terrain. At first, Robert didn't pay it much mind. The property line between his land and the new subdivision was clear, buffered by a dry creek and protected by a right-of-way clause that explicitly excluded any through access. But new communities had a habit of bringing more than just families. They brought governance. Within a few months, Robert noticed unfamiliar signs dotting the trails bordering his land. Simple placards at first: private path, no trespassing, mounted on temporary stakes written in bold, unfriendly fonts. He removed the ones planted on his side without much thought, assuming they were mistakes. Then came the drones. He would hear them buzz in the distance, their mechanical wings twitching just beyond tree lines, sometimes drifting over his roof before disappearing into the canopy. One day he found a package on his trailhead, an unopened box of trail cameras with a printed note inside. For your safety, in cooperation with Valley Crest Coordination. It was unsigned. He placed it on a stump, poured kerosene on it, and lit it with a match. He didn't care for intimidation, even in its most passive-aggressive forms. The first time he met Karen Tracy, she introduced herself as if Robert were the guest and she the landowner. She showed up at the lower trail bend in a wide-brimmed hat, manicured fingernails, and hiking boots that looked like they'd never touched mud. "Oh, I've been meaning to find you," she had said, smiling with the flatness of someone who never doubted their own authority. "I'm Karen. I'm sort of the coordinator for Valley Crest. You've probably seen the development. It's important we get to know all the stakeholders in the area." Robert had blinked slowly, his expression neutral. Stakeholders? He echoed. I own this valley. What stake do you think you have here? She had laughed, delicately the way people do when they're not sure if you're joking. Well, of course, that's your perspective, she said, as if correcting a child. But we have easement discussions underway, and there's been concern about some unregistered structures downhill. The county wasn't sure who to contact, so here I am. Robert had nodded, quietly picking up a nearby stick and snapping it in half without looking away from her. If you want to talk structures, you can start with the 1893 outpost designation. It's on record. So's the federal acquisition transfer and the water rights deed. You can find it all downtown. I'm sure someone like you knows how to read a map. Karen hadn't responded. She just smiled tighter and excused herself, noting she would follow up in writing. And she did. Less than a week later, a formal letter from a consulting firm in a neighboring city arrived at Robert's post office box. The letter outlined a request for an environmental compliance inspection to verify whether any unauthorized constructions were taking place within a disputed buffer zone. There was no legal signature, no enforcement agency name, just logos, buzzwords, and an invitation to voluntarily cooperate for the safety of all nearby residents. Robert didn't reply. Instead, he drove into the city, walked into the county clerk's office, and had certified copies made of every title, map overlay, zoning exemption, and land designation tied to his property. He sent the package to the firm with a sticky note. Next time you want to waste paper, do it with your own money. What Robert didn't know yet was that Karen was not used to losing, especially not to quiet men in canvas jackets who didn't answer to her tone. She had already begun leveraging her influence. Not officially, of course. People like Karen didn't need titles, they only needed circles, and she had a few. Property investors, civil board members, even a cousin working as an assistant to the deputy registrar. She didn't want Robert gone necessarily, she just wanted him in line. Predictable, malleable. When people moved into Valley Crest, they paid for control of their aesthetics, their neighbors, and their peace of mind. And in Karen's mind, nothing disrupted that peace more than a man who didn't ask permission to exist. Robert felt the shift before he saw it. The quiet began to fracture, not with volume, but with weight. His mail started arriving opened. His trail cams caught flashes of lights at night in places no one should be walking. He found a stake with survey tape planted deep within his property, several hundred feet past the easement line. The tape had no initials, no reference code, just a number, 2I-17. He checked every known survey report for the number and found nothing. It wasn't official, it was a signal. And that's when he knew. This wasn't about misunderstanding or even a land grab in the traditional sense. This was territorial theater. Power tested not through court filings or bank accounts, but through persistence. Karen had underestimated Robert because he didn't raise his voice. What she failed to understand was that Robert had spent his life reading fault lines. Not just in rock, but in people. He knew when something was about to break, and this time, he wasn't planning to stand still and let it happen. The letter didn't come certified, nor was it hand-delivered. It arrived on a Monday morning folded neatly into Robert's metal mailbox at the county trail station down the road, a place he only checked once a week. It had no return address, but the envelope was thick, printed on textured paper, and bore a faint watermark of a private planning consortium. He recognized only vaguely from a newspaper headline a few years back. He didn't open it there. He placed it carefully between a supply invoice and a field report form, and didn't read it until he was seated at his desk, later that evening with a mug of strong coffee, and the low hum of his weather station whirring beside him. The letter's contents were wrapped in professional language, padded with phrases like regulatory concerns, unofficial reports of development activity, and preliminary jurisdictional review. But the meat of it was a notice. His cabin, along with unspecified associated structures, had been flagged for potential zoning non-compliance and environmental disruption. It wasn't a cease and desist, not yet, but it was the prelude, the bureaucratic tightening of a noose made from glossy terms and vague allegations. Robert read it twice, then a third time. Nowhere in the document was there any direct reference to a legal code or citation, just a list of questions posed in passive voice, the kind you use when you want to appear cooperative while setting the stage for litigation. He knew where this was coming from. Karen's casual threat during their trail encounter had been laced with more than just neighborhood curiosity. Her use of terms like easement and unregistered structure weren't the fumbling guesses of a concerned citizen. They were calculated, repeated buzzwords from someone who had spoken to legal counsel, or someone within the system. This was her opening shot, and it wasn't meant to win. It was meant to exhaust him into retreat. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and placed the letter flat on the desk. Then he stood, walked over to the file cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a folder labeled Titles and Regulatory Protections. Inside were notarized documents, stamped approvals, and correspondence with the county from years ago that laid out in plain terms the exemptions and allowances his land was protected under. This wasn't just paperwork, it was armor. And now it was time to use it. The next morning, Robert drove into the county municipal office, not to file a complaint, but to request a formal review of the letter under the Freedom of Information Act. He wanted the names. Whoever submitted the original complaint would be logged, and he had every right to see it. The clerk at the desk was new, young, trying to be helpful but clearly unfamiliar with the details of land jurisdiction outside incorporated districts. She referred him to another department where an older woman, Martha, with tightly tied-back gray hair and a voice like gravel, listened to Robert's explanation, nodded once, and took his paperwork without asking unnecessary questions. "You'll hear from us in 7 business days," she said, stamping the form with finality. Robert left the office without drama, without confrontation. He knew how to play the long game. 7 days wasn't a delay, it was breathing room. 2 evenings later, while walking the lower path near the western spring, he noticed something that gave him pause. A plastic tag had been affixed to one of the old pines, a small circular disc about the size of a poker chip, metallic on one side, matte gray on the other. It wasn't local survey equipment. Robert had seen enough tagging systems to recognize the difference. This was wireless, likely Bluetooth or RFID, and it had no business being on his land. He marked the location on his topographic map and removed the tag with a pocket knife, placing it into a Faraday pouch when he got back to the cabin. No need to destroy it, not yet. Let whoever placed it wonder if it had been found. Psychological disruption could go both ways. The next morning, a black SUV drove up to the unofficial parking area near the Forest Service boundary, well short of Robert's property, but close enough to feel deliberate. He watched from a distance, high on the bluff trail, through a pair of field binoculars. 2 individuals stepped out. One man, one woman, both dressed not in uniforms but in coordinated business casual attire, the sort that reeked of field liaison ambiguity. They didn't carry notebooks, but they did take photos. He watched them pace along the boundary tape, occasionally pointing at elevation markers and making exaggerated gestures. They didn't attempt to cross the line, but their presence confirmed what he already suspected. This was more than a neighborhood squabble. Someone was trying to build a case, unofficially, perhaps even extra-legally, but persistently. They were creating optics, the illusion of review, hoping to provoke a mistake or overreaction. Robert didn't rise to the bait. He documented everything. Timestamps, photos of the SUV's plate, trail cam footage synced to cloud backup. That evening, he added a new entry to his land use journal, noting the increased presence of unknown individuals and unauthorized devices. It wasn't paranoia, it was protocol. And if this escalated into court, the judge would appreciate meticulous records far more than angry tirades. On the 5th day after submitting his FOIA request, Robert received an envelope postmarked from the county office. Inside was a single sheet listing the complaint originator as Karen Tracy, Community Representative, Valley Crest Coordination Committee. Not a government official, not a licensed planner, just a neighbor with connections and a taste for authority. She had submitted the complaint under a public nuisance clause tied to unregulated runoff and visual degradation of protected viewshed corridors. It was laughably tenuous. Viewshed corridor? He wasn't blocking a highway or coastal overlook. He was maintaining a cabin at the bottom of a valley, surrounded by trees, invisible from public roads. But the allegation didn't need to be credible. It only needed to be persistent enough to generate inquiry. That night, it rained. Not a soft drizzle, but a pounding spring downpour that thrashed the trees and turned the trails into muddy veins. Robert stood on his covered porch, watching the forest breathe under the storm's rhythm, letting the water drown out the white noise of his thoughts. He hadn't chosen this fight, but he also wasn't going to walk away from land he had restored, protected, and brought back from the brink of bureaucratic neglect. People like Karen didn't understand stewardship. They understood control. And while Robert had no desire for war, he understood one unshakable truth. Control without legitimacy was just trespass in slow motion. The following day, he filed a formal response to the letter, accompanied by certified documents outlining the scope of his property rights, zoning exemptions, and environmental use protections. He included detailed maps and copies of his inspections and maintenance logs for the past 12 months. Then, to make sure it wasn't quietly buried, he sent digital copies directly to the head of the County Land Use Commission, someone he had once co-authored a terrain compliance report with, back when his name still circulated in municipal offices. He didn't add personal notes, just the facts. Let the evidence speak. Let the bureaucracy chew on its own tail. But even as he mounted his defense, Robert knew the deeper threat wasn't paper, it was persistence. Karen wouldn't stop. Not now. Not with her pride on the line and a community watching. She'd press harder, escalate tactics, maybe even bend the rules she claimed to uphold. And so he prepared, not for violence, but for volume. Because some wars weren't won by yelling louder or drawing lines in the dirt. Some wars were won with ink, time, and the quiet refusal to yield. The weather shifted just enough to put tension in the air. A dry stretch followed by crisp wind that carried the scent of disturbed earth. Robert noticed it before he saw anything tangible, not because he was looking for trouble, but because the land told him. The trail that normally stayed compact had fine dust gathering in odd places, like someone had walked it out of rhythm. Moss along a certain stone outcropping had fresh scarring on one side. The northern fence post, once leaning subtly as it had for years, now stood straighter, as if someone had used it to pivot their weight. These were not dramatic signs, but Robert had learned to read subtlety like others read headlines. Something had changed. By midweek, he confirmed it. A narrow dirt path, just wide enough for ATV tires, had appeared at the edge of the ridgeline closest to Valley Crest. It wasn't a full trail, not yet, but it was deliberate. Cut brush, compacted soil, and faint marks where survey flags had been driven and then removed. Robert didn't disturb it. Instead, he marked its coordinates and returned to his cabin. That night, he spent 2 hours cross-referencing recent county permits. As expected, nothing had been filed. No utility expansion, no emergency egress path approvals. The route had no legal standing. It was speculative infrastructure. Someone trying to build first, file later. 3 days later, a letter arrived. Not from the county, but from a private contractor in Bakersfield. The header was polished and formal, but the tone was anything but. It referenced community access recommendations and requested temporary entry across Robert's southern property border for future road study alignment, with the suggestion that failure to respond would result in assumptions of passive non-cooperation. It was passive-aggressive pressure dressed up in the language of civil engineering. Robert scanned the document twice, noted the total absence of legal authorization, and filed it under pre-litigation bluffing. He did not respond. That silence was apparently enough provocation. The following week, he discovered the trail had expanded. Not only that, but new stakes had been placed. Bright red with tags that read Prelim 217C and coordinates corresponding suspiciously close to one of his irrigation lines. This was no longer harmless encroachment. Whoever was backing this effort had transitioned from observation to projection. They were beginning to act as though his land was malleable, that its edges were open to reinterpretation. He removed the stakes, photographed each one, and placed them in a weatherproof bin in his shed. He wasn't going to destroy evidence. Not yet. The next evening, as he returned from inspecting the western slope, he noticed something chilling. One of his motion-activated cameras had been removed, not simply broken or damaged, but unmounted cleanly and quietly. The bracket was still intact. The SD card was gone. There were no drag marks, no prints, no misplaced stones. Whoever had done it knew how to move without trace. This wasn't just escalation. This was precision, and precision meant planning. Robert replaced the camera with a decoy, identical in appearance but useless inside, and turned his attention to defense. He reached out to a private security contact he trusted from his time consulting with state contracts, a quiet man named Doran, who had since moved into environmental risk assessment. Doran wasn't a bodyguard. He specialized in perimeter integrity, digital surveillance, and land use reconnaissance. Robert didn't ask for protection, he asked for a system audit. "Walk it like it's hostile," he said over the phone. "No red tape. I want blind spots exposed, and I want confirmation on signal vulnerabilities." Doran agreed and scheduled a 2-day sweep the following week. But before Doran could arrive, the next message came. This time, not subtle and not deniable. One morning, Robert found a glossy trifold brochure wedged into the latch of his gate. It was a polished mock-up of a development proposal, complete with renderings of modern homes, walking trails, and a planned nature reserve corridor running directly through the southern half of his land. The reserve was marked with shaded green, labeled Future Cooperative Easement, pending review. Robert's name did not appear anywhere on the document. He wasn't being asked. He was being erased. He scanned every page and found the developer's name buried in small text on the final panel. Delora Land Ventures. He knew them. They were infamous for land banking, for quietly buying parcels in fragmented regions, using political donations to grease zoning boards, then steamrolling objections under a mountain of paperwork and procedural fatigue. They rarely lost. Robert spent the rest of the day reviewing his boundaries, matching satellite imagery to deed maps, and confirming that every inch of his land remained under his control. It did, but the fact that someone felt confident enough to print that brochure meant they believed the situation was already moving in their favor. 2 days before Doran's arrival, Robert caught a figure on the edge of his trail. At first glance, it was just a silhouette. Tall, motionless, facing his cabin from beyond the clearing. But as Robert stepped onto the porch, the figure turned and calmly walked away. Not hurried, but purposeful. When he reached the spot, there were boot prints, military tread, heavy heel pressure, and a slight drag on the right foot. Not a local hiker, someone trained. He didn't call the sheriff, not yet. He needed more than footprints and gut instinct. When Doran arrived, he brought 2 duffel bags and a portable signal scanner. They walked the perimeter together, Doran asking sparse questions, mostly nodding, occasionally pointing out small things. Heat anomalies in soil, irregularities in passive signals. Near the northeast trail, they found 2 signal repeaters buried under a pile of mossy stone. Not strong enough to transmit data over long distances, but more than enough to link short-range devices. Surveillance nodes, cheap, disposable, effective. Doran simply muttered, "This isn't neighborhood paranoia, this is pressure testing." Robert nodded and asked him to install a second layer of hidden cameras and encrypted data relays. No more SD cards, no more local storage. Everything would go straight to a remote drive Doran maintained off-grid in another state. That night, Robert wrote a letter. Not an angry one, and not one meant for any inbox. It was a contingency draft, to be sent only if something happened. It contained login credentials, map overlays, a chain of documented encroachments, and the contact information of 3 former colleagues now working in state regulatory agencies. He sealed it in a waterproof envelope, placed it in the floor safe, and locked it beneath the emergency beacon transmitter that hadn't been used in over 7 years. The tension wasn't in the actions anymore. It was in the pace. The slow, grinding, incremental moves being made against him weren't about intimidation. They were about inevitability. They were testing how much they could take before he broke formation. But Robert Lawson didn't flinch. He logged, he observed, he fortified. Not out of fear, but because he knew that once the right people were watching, the game would change. They weren't ready for that part. They thought he was just a man in a cabin, holding on to a past that didn't matter. What they didn't understand was that he wasn't holding on. He was preparing. The land had spoken, and Robert was listening. The shift came not with a confrontation, but with a signature. Robert received a certified envelope on a Thursday afternoon, delivered not to his usual mailbox, but directly to his gate, handed over by a courier who didn't linger, didn't smile, and didn't offer conversation. The return address was a Sacramento law firm, specializing in land use and development arbitration. Inside was a formal request for participation in mediation proceedings, tied to what the letter referred to as a disputed buffer zone surrounding the Valley Crest development. The attached documents, thick with case references and planning jargon, made it clear that a hearing had already been scheduled. It wasn't a summons yet, but it was the clearest signal so far that Robert had been drawn into a legal mechanism that someone, somewhere, intended to use as leverage. He read the packet slowly, twice under the dull glow of his cabin's overhead lamp. The language was precise, leaning heavily on the idea that his undeveloped land was interfering with proposed expansion paths that were aligned with regional accessibility goals. Nowhere did the documents acknowledge his existing protections. There was no mention of his environmental designation, no reference to his coordination with the county, and certainly no recognition of the historical registry status the land held. It was a one-sided proposition dressed up as mutual cooperation, a request for him to justify his own existence within boundaries that had been his before Valley Crest had existed on paper. They weren't accusing him of wrongdoing outright. They were trying to redefine the narrative entirely. Rather than respond directly, Robert did what he knew would be most effective. He contacted Lucinda Graham, a senior official with the county's Environmental Oversight Division, with whom he had worked briefly during the wildfire response audits 2 years prior. Lucinda wasn't a close contact, but she was professional, respected, and notably unimpressed by private sector influence. He didn't send an email. He called her directly and left a message with only 3 sentences. Lucinda, this is Robert Lawson. I have received a mediation packet referencing land under environmental restriction. Someone's trying to repurpose a legally protected zone. If this affects your department's jurisdiction, I'd like clarity. Within 24 hours, she called back, her voice calm but clipped. I've seen the filing, she said. It didn't cross my desk the right way. You're not the only parcel they're circling. Sit tight. I'm flagging it and pulling jurisdictional maps from archives. You'll get a call from planning within 72 hours. She hung up before he could ask anything else, which in Robert's mind meant she had already started making calls of her own. He didn't celebrate. He logged the exchange, copied the packet, and began preparing a formal land impact review summary using the latest data from his monitoring system. He included water tables, erosion metrics, soil condition comparisons year over year. It wasn't defense, it was offense by data. What he didn't expect 3 days later was for the sheriff to show up. Not a deputy, the sheriff himself. A tall man with silver at his temples, boots caked in real use, not for show. He didn't come to the door with papers or questions. He stood just past the threshold of the porch, arms crossed, and looked at Robert with a weary expression that hinted at familiarity beneath duty. I'm here unofficially, he said, but I got a courtesy call from someone downtown asking if we had any active disputes out here. You want to tell me why your name came up in a development dispute tagged under emergency access concerns? Robert handed him the mediation documents and pointed toward the flagged map sections, explaining without embellishment how every line, every shaded overlay directly contradicted the official records. The sheriff listened, flipping through the pages, occasionally nodding or sighing. When he finished, he tapped the top page and said, "This shouldn't be happening, and you know it. I've got 30 years on this beat, and I've seen land flips start like this more times than I can count. Usually it's some old widow with unpaid taxes or absentee owners too far away to fight it. You're neither. So I'm going to tell you something you already know. They're going to try to make this about something else. Fire safety, access, emergency infrastructure. Not because it's real, but because it tests well in court." Robert nodded slowly. "I'm not moving, and I'm not folding." The sheriff grunted. "I didn't think you would. You've got the paperwork. But don't assume that's enough. This isn't about what's legal. It's about who gets tired first." He left shortly after, not with threats or promises, but with a handshake and a rare acknowledgement. If I get a call to escort someone up here, I'll call you first. That's the most I can do without raising flags. The next day, Robert received an email from Lucinda's department, brief but potent. It confirmed the land's protected status and included a formal memorandum of concern filed against the development's parent company for potential jurisdictional overreach. She copied the regional land board, 2 environmental legal advocates, and a state auditor. He printed it, folded it, and placed it in the same file as the others. A corner had turned. They weren't just playing offense anymore. They were being watched. Yet, it wasn't over. That night, the trail sensor near the southern ridge pinged twice, once at 2:11 a.m., again at 2:14. Robert reviewed the footage and saw nothing but blur, shadow, and the brief glint of reflective tape. He adjusted the sensors, increased the frame rate capture, and began sleeping with his boots nearby. Not because he was afraid, because he was ready. The weather turned colder, unusually so for the season, the air sharp with the edge of a late frost that arrived ahead of schedule, as if the valley itself had decided to go quiet, tense, anticipating what would come next. Robert moved through his routines with mechanical precision, checking water systems, reviewing sensor logs, recalibrating his solar infrastructure, and yet his mind was never fully in the task. It had begun to feel like waiting for the next pressure point, for the next move on a board he hadn't asked to play on but could no longer ignore. For weeks there had been only quiet flickers of movement at the periphery, footprints that ended abruptly, tire tracks where no road legally existed, nighttime drone passes too high to intercept but low enough to be seen against the stars. Robert kept records, filed updates, sent data to Lucinda's team and to Doran's off-site archive, and added to the growing file of what had once been a land stewardship journal but now read more like a war log. It wasn't just encroachment anymore. It was psychological war by 1,000 silent cuts. Then came the press release. He didn't receive it directly. It was forwarded to him by an old acquaintance in the county's emergency services department. A brief email with no message except the link. The development group behind Valley Crest had published an official statement on their website, announcing the next phase of community expansion, framed as a public-private partnership to increase wildfire accessibility and emergency response. Capacity. It mentioned a proposed access corridor, cooperatively negotiated with local landowners, that would pass through the southeastern segment of what Robert knew to be his land. The document was slick, filled with euphemisms, but the message was clear. They had moved from speculation to narrative construction. They were no longer waiting for permission. They were claiming consent retroactively, counting on silence and misdirection to carry them forward. Robert printed the release, highlighted the key passages, and sent a scanned version to Lucinda with the subject line, claiming access through my land, still without consent. She replied within the hour, short but firm. You're covered. We're filing a response. Do not engage directly. That last sentence sat heavy with him. Do not engage. It made sense tactically, but it also reflected the grim reality of this new stage. The opponent was no longer just Karen or a handful of local players. It was a machine of coordinated influence, hiding behind civility and process, pushing forward by sheer repetition. 2 days later, one of his trail cams caught what he'd been waiting for. Just after midnight, 3 men entered his property from the northeast, moving in coordinated fashion, one holding what looked like a rangefinder, another carrying a folded tripod, the third pacing the perimeter while speaking quietly into a handheld radio. They didn't go near the cabin. Instead, they spent exactly 12 minutes placing flagged markers in a diagonal line before retreating the way they came. Robert reviewed the footage in silence, then filed a report with Lucinda's department, including time-stamped GPS coordinates and thermal imaging stills from his secondary camera system. He included a summary of the past 2 months of incursions, paired with the Valley Crest press release, and flagged the report as urgent. He received no reply that night, which didn't worry him. The system would take its time, but by morning, the camera that had recorded the incursion was gone. Mount ripped clean, wires severed, housing missing. Robert didn't replace it immediately. Instead, he activated a secondary array Doran had installed. A hidden set of sensors buried beneath the trail gravel, rigged to silently transmit motion data without drawing attention. That morning, he also made a decision he hadn't wanted to face. He drove into the county seat and retained a land use attorney, not to file suit, not yet, but to establish formal representation and ensure that any new claims filed against him would be intercepted before they reached the mediation phase. The lawyer, a pragmatic woman named Beatrice Moran, listened without interruption as Robert laid out the events, showing her maps, documents, and digital records. When he finished, she leaned back and simply said, "They're counting on you to make one mistake, to look hostile, to react emotionally, to block a surveyor who's technically still on public land, or to damage a flagged stake that hasn't yet crossed your line on paper. If you do, they'll leverage it. They don't want your land as much as they want you labeled as unreasonable." Robert nodded. "That's why I document everything." Beatrice replied, "Good, because when this gets loud, and it will, you'll need to prove not just that you're right, but that you stayed right." 2 days later, Robert received notice that a new civil petition had been filed by Valley Crest corporate entity requesting an emergency hearing to expedite cooperative land access based on projected environmental risk. The filing argued that failure to grant access to their emergency corridor could create catastrophic delays in first responder services to nearby communities. It was a scare tactic, but a well-crafted one. Robert reviewed the filing and sent it directly to Beatrice, who replied within the hour. "I've read it. They're attempting to leverage the county's fire mitigation regulations. I'll respond before it hits the docket." But Robert had no intention of just playing defense. That evening, he requested a historical audit from the county registrar, asking for any and all easement filings tied to his parcel dating back 50 years. It was tedious work, but buried within the old microfilm scans was a document he'd suspected existed but had never needed before. A 1984 stipulation signed by the county board explicitly stating that any future road easement through the valley would require full landowner consent unless authorized by a state-level emergency declaration. No such declaration existed. No such consent had ever been given. He printed 5 copies and sent one directly to Lucinda, one to Beatrice, and one to the sheriff with a short note. Historical restriction attached. Thought this might help clarify some things. The next week was quiet, suspiciously so. No new trails, no new mailings, no more nighttime movement. But silence, Robert had learned, often meant recalibration, not retreat. That proved true when he received a letter from a private utility company claiming they had been contracted to evaluate feasibility for a shared grid expansion and required temporary access to place test conduits on the southern end of his property. There was no return phone number, just an email. Robert ignored the email and instead forwarded the letter to Beatrice with a simple request. "Can you verify who's behind this?" Her response came the next day. Delora Ventures. Same legal rep as Valley Crest. New tactic, same goal. That night, Robert sat on his porch and listened. Not to noise, but to the absence of it. The way the valley held its breath. The way the air moved across the grass like it was waiting. There were no lights on the ridge, no movement in the tree line. And yet, he felt something deeper now. A presence, not physical, but administrative, invasive in its own way. They weren't just coming through the woods. They were coming through systems, forms, signatures. They were embedding themselves in the language of governance so that one day they wouldn't have to trespass. They'd already be written in. Robert stood and went inside, pulled out the weather-sealed envelope from his floor safe, and added a new page. Details of the easement restriction, time-stamped legal correspondence, and a backup drive containing all video footage to date. It was redundancy, not fear. Insurance against erasure. If they were going to try and bury him under layers of bureaucracy, he'd make sure each layer had a knife embedded in it, pointed up. He didn't know when the next blow would come, but he was certain of one thing. It would not come with warning, and when it did, he would not meet it as a victim. He would meet it as the man who had never stopped watching. It began not with an attack, but with an announcement. On a pale morning that carried the scent of thawing frost and damp pine, Robert awoke to a message on his satellite inbox, forwarded by Beatrice, flagged as urgent. The county had issued a preliminary approval to fast-track emergency access routes tied to a new wildfire evacuation protocol. Attached were 5 pages of proposed corridor overlays, with a section that sliced directly through the southern basin of Robert's land. There was no signature, no official hearing record, and no notice served to affected landowners. It was a draft marked for internal use only. But the message between the lines was unmistakable. They were moving, and they were done pretending they weren't. The timing, as always, was strategic. It coincided with a seasonal uptick in wildfire warnings, a moment when the fear of catastrophe lowered resistance to regulatory overreach. Karen Tracy reappeared, not in person but in print. Her name led an op-ed in the county's largest paper titled "The Valley is Burning, and One Man Could Block Your Escape." It didn't mention Robert directly, but it didn't need to. It referenced private landowners refusing to collaborate, isolated structures with unknown legality, and one holdout obstructing community safety. The piece was a PR weapon, launched with surgical precision. It framed Robert not as a neighbor, but as a liability. By noon, he had 3 voicemails. One from a county clerk, double-checking zoning data, another from a local real estate columnist requesting comment, and one from a resident of Valley Crest who left no name but warned, "They're saying you're putting lives at risk. If there's a fire, you'll be responsible." That one he saved, flagged, and sent directly to Beatrice with the note, "Harassment or groundwork for litigation." She replied within an hour, "Both. Stay calm. We're filing injunctive notice today." But calm wasn't the issue. Robert wasn't shaken. He was cornered. And when cornered, he didn't flail. He moved precisely. First, he sent Lucinda the op-ed, attaching the original land classification documents, the historical easement restriction, and a statement asserting that no request for cooperation had ever been formally submitted through her department. She responded immediately with a directive. "Do not respond publicly. We're bringing in state-level review." That was the second signal. The first had been the draft map. The third came later that evening, as dusk broke across the treetops like a split seam. A convoy of 3 unmarked trucks parked along the edge of the southern boundary. The men who stepped out wore county-issued vests but carried no identification. They began measuring, photographing, placing small orange flags at intervals that crept steadily toward his central field. Robert didn't go out to meet them. He didn't argue or posture. Instead, he activated his high-resolution cameras, began live-streaming the activity to a private server, and contacted the sheriff's office. Not the station, but the sheriff directly. "There are unauthorized survey teams on my land," he said flatly. "No court order, no identification. I have them on video." The sheriff responded within 15 minutes. "Stay where you are. Don't engage. I'm en route." What followed was a confrontation not of shouting or violence, but of sharp legal lines and uncomfortable silence. The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies and requested identification from every person present. One man claimed to be a subcontractor under Delora Ventures. When pressed, he admitted he had no physical permit on site, only an email authorization from the development liaison. The sheriff didn't raise his voice. He simply asked them to leave the property immediately and warned that any further entries without legal service would be treated as criminal trespass. They left, grumbling and slow, but they left. Robert didn't gloat. He filed a supplemental incident report, updated his archive, and prepared for retaliation. It came the next morning in the form of a cease and desist letter. Except this time, it was addressed to him. The document accused Robert of obstructing public safety infrastructure planning, citing vague county statutes and referencing a community danger clause that Beatrice would later confirm had no legal precedent. It was a bluff, and a poorly constructed one. But it came with a threat. If he didn't permit access for emergency infrastructure review within 72 hours, the company would seek a temporary court order granting conditional entry. Robert did not wait 72 hours. He responded in 36, delivering a notarized declaration to the county zoning board, Lucinda's office, and the Superior Court, outlining in detail the historical easement protections, the lack of formal engagement, the coordinated harassment, campaign and the documented presence of unauthorized personnel. Beatrice followed it with an injunction request backed by environmental assessments, and Lucinda's department released an internal advisory freezing all proposed activity in disputed areas pending legal resolution. The development's momentum faltered. For the first time, their narrative was being checked, publicly, procedurally, and with facts that couldn't be drowned out by optics. But it wasn't over. Karen reappeared 2 days later, walking the northern ridge just inside the shared boundary line, arms folded, phone in hand, speaking loudly to no one in particular about obstructionists and willful negligence. Robert watched her from the porch, expression unreadable, until she noticed and waved with the smugness of someone who still believed in victory through noise. But it wasn't noise that won wars. It was records, patience, precision. And when Lucinda confirmed that a formal state audit had been scheduled to review the development's compliance across the entire valley, something that would bring in inspectors, attorneys, and possibly even prosecutors, Robert knew the storm had crested. The machine was still moving, but it was now doing so under scrutiny. And machines that move under light tend to slow, falter, and reveal their weak welds. As the sun set that evening, casting gold over the pine needles and reflecting off the steel plates on his solar array, Robert stood at the edge of the South Trail, staring down toward the place where the orange flags had been planted and since removed. It was quiet again. Not the stillness of defeat, but the calm that follows a decisive turn. He knew they would try again, through different angles, through softer hands or colder paperwork, but they'd been exposed, and now they were bleeding time, credibility, and control. Spring bled into early summer with the quiet insistence of something recovering from injury. The rains had passed, the frost receded, and the trees had returned to full canopy as if nothing had happened, though Robert knew better. Scars remained, even in places that looked whole. But the silence was no longer heavy. It was earned. The development plans that had once loomed like a storm cloud now hung stalled in litigation, tied down by overlapping agency investigations and formal audits initiated by the state. After Lucinda's office submitted a cross-jurisdictional violation report, what was once a private dispute had been elevated to a regional oversight matter. The company behind Valley Crest had gone quiet. Delora Ventures removed all mention of the emergency access corridor from their public website, and the brochure that had once portrayed Robert's land as a green cooperative path was now part of a pending review for misrepresentation of zoning boundaries. Karen Tracy, once the loudest voice in their crusade, had vanished from the community's spotlight after it was discovered, through an anonymous leak, that she had applied for and received a private equity grant to support expansion facilitation, despite presenting herself as an unpaid resident representative. Her name no longer appeared on press releases or public meeting dockets. Robert didn't celebrate. He didn't post statements, didn't give interviews, didn't respond to the local podcast that requested his side of the story. He returned instead to the rhythm he had built long before Valley Crest arrived. Trail maintenance, soil sampling, structural inspections. There was peace in tasks that asked nothing of him but care. But the cabin was no longer just a home. It had become a symbol whether he wanted it to or not. The county had quietly asked him to participate in a community roundtable on land rights. And while he declined, he provided written testimony that outlined not just his case, but a detailed roadmap for how unchecked influence could manipulate zoning. Frameworks to target vulnerable property owners. Beatrice submitted it under a protective clause, and it was cited 3 times in the final oversight report issued by the State Planning Board. That report concluded with a recommendation for stricter pre-approval transparency laws and a rollback of speculative development practices in environmentally sensitive regions. Lucinda sent him a handwritten note, simple and direct. You held the line. Most don't. Thank you. It was tucked inside a manila envelope containing copies of the final rulings, which confirmed the invalidation of the corridor overlay and the suspension of all future infrastructural easement claims tied to his land. The development company faced fines, and several contracts tied to the expansion were formally annulled. Robert stored the documents in the same floor safe that had once held the emergency letter, now obsolete. He didn't throw anything out. One never did when dealing with people who viewed land not as place but as product. But the moment had passed. The threat for now was behind him. Doran checked in briefly, offering to retrieve the remaining surveillance nodes and relay backups, but Robert told him to leave them until autumn, just in case. The valley returned to itself slowly. Animals that had gone scarce during the months of disturbance began reappearing. Tracks in the mud, rustles in the underbrush, a nest rebuilt in the old eaves. Robert spent more time walking the perimeter not from obligation but familiarity. It was a part of him, as much as the cabin or the map overlays. And though he spoke to no one about what had happened in full, the land bore witness. The sheriff stopped by once, unannounced, pulling up in a dusty county truck and offering a thermos of black coffee and a nod. Thought I'd see how the place looks without survey flags and fake permits. Robert offered no sarcasm, only a quiet smirk and a seat. They sat for 20 minutes without discussing the conflict, talking instead about rainfall, an uptick in coyote activity, and a landslide on the eastern ridge that had narrowly missed a trailhead. When the sheriff left, he paused beside his truck and said, "They'll try someone else next time. But now there's a record. They'll think twice." Robert didn't respond, only nodded once and watched as the vehicle disappeared into the trees. That night, he took the last flag stake, one that had been missed during cleanup, buried beneath ferns near the southern slope, and planted it upside down near the cabin, not as a warning, but a reminder. Not all battles were won by force. Some were won by standing still, by refusing to be erased, and by knowing absolutely and without question where your line was drawn, and who you were when you stood on it.